Hello and welcome to the Adam Ruins Everything podcast. I am your host, Adam Conover. I'm the host of this podcast, and I'm the host of a TV show on True TV called Adam Ruins Everything, and this is the podcast version of that show. But if you haven't seen the show, you'll still enjoy the podcast, I promise. But let me just tell you what the premise is, and I'll give you the whole idea of the Adam Ruins Everything TV show and podcast universe. On the TV show, I tell you countless facts about everything you never needed to want to, never want to need to know. We have a complicated slogan we use sometimes, and it's something along those lines. I never remember it exactly. But on the show, I talk to fascinating experts for 30 seconds, 45 seconds. Not very long, just enough to prove their point, tell us about their amazing work, and get out of there. On this podcast, we bring them back in, and I talk to them for 30 minutes. 45 minutes, 60 minutes about their incredible field of expertise because, you know, honestly, they're worth it. These people are, look, I'll be honest, and I'm going to be totally frank with you guys. The reason I do the podcast is because it enables me to talk to these people for longer. Does that make sense? I'm just some dumbass stand-up comedian, right? But by doing this podcast, by doing the TV show and then the podcast, I get to meet the most fascinating, interesting people, like people who are doing work on such an incredibly high level that it's like a pleasure and a gift to meet them. And our guest today is a perfect example of that, and I'm going to tell you why in just a second. Before that, I got to get some stuff out of the way. The TV show version of this podcast is back. It's back on the air. It's on TV. You can see it every Tuesday on True TV, Tuesdays at 10, or you can find clips and full episodes at truetv.com/AdamRuinsEverything and the Watch True TV app. Also, this is the part where I would tell you guys that I am going on tour. However, I am back from the tour by the time you have heard this. So thank you, everybody who came out. I hope you had a good time. And if you missed me, guys, I'll probably go on tour again next year because, honestly, that's the best part of being a comedian. So I'm sure I'll do it many times in the future. Performing is a gift and a pleasure. Okay. So today's guest, let me tell you about him. I have been so excited to talk to him for months. His name is Chris Fabricant. He appeared on the Forensic Science episode of Adam Ruins Everything from 2015. Chris is a lawyer at the Innocence Project. I don't know if you guys know the Innocence Project. They're an incredible group that works to free the wrongfully imprisoned. They go around the country and they take on cases of people who were convicted for long, long sentences, decades, life sentences, and they retry the cases, right? They take them back to court and they get the wrongfully imprisoned released. It's such an incredible service that they do. And Chris specifically leads the Innocence Project's strategic litigation department. And so that means they develop strategies in order to try to solve the problems in the criminal justice system by bringing these cases. He's such an incredible guy who does incredible, fascinating work. And honestly, look, the Forensic Science episode was maybe the third or fourth episode of the show we shot, period. So it was very new to me. You know, I was still like very frenetic and like, oh my God, I got to remember all my lines, and I hope the shooting is going well. And when Chris came on set, he was such a fascinating person, and I spent the entire lunch hour like talking to him, talking about his work, getting into it with him, and that was the moment at which I realized, wait a second, we should do a podcast so I can talk to guys like him in further depth. And honestly, both because I want you to hear it and just because like I want him to be my friend, you know, just because I wanted to talk to him more. So that's what I mean when I say that the whole thing about the podcast is just putting myself on a level where I get to talk to people. Like it's incredible. Okay, so let's get to the interview. Chris is joining us remotely from New York. We're talking. Let's go to the audio tape. Well, I'm here with Chris Fabricant. Thank you so much for being here, Chris.
My pleasure, Adam.
You were so awesome on the show. You were like, I don't know if you get this, but you almost seem like a TV lawyer. Like meeting you, it's like, oh, you're like too perfectly cast for your job.
Well, believe me, I got endless shit about that at work, so maybe that's a double-edged sword for somebody like me.
Yeah, just for being on the show, they're like, oh, you're a big TV star now?
For being on the show and for not totally, defecating the bed.
Yeah, they're like, oh, you're slick. Well, for me, the experience of having you on the show was amazing because I had just started doing the show, and I'm just like, sort of like a dumb little comedian trying to put a TV show together. But then to meet you and talk to you about the work that you do was such an incredible opportunity. So we were very grateful to have you. Can you just sort of summarize, what the work that you do is, like what the mission of the Innocence Project is for people who don't know, and what your job is within it?
Right. Well, fundamentally, the Innocence Project uses DNA evidence to free the wrongly convicted, and we also engage in reform efforts to prevent wrongful convictions from occurring in the future. So really, the work is fundamentally freeing the innocent, and we use scientific evidence to do that. And the work on reform and trying to make the criminal justice system more just, more scientifically accurate is the work that the Strategic Litigation Department does and the Policy Department in the Innocence Project do. So my role there, apart from running the department, the Strategic Litigation Department, is litigation around the leading contributing factors of wrongful conviction. And so we work on eyewitness misidentification issues, we work on forensic sciences, and we work on false confessions. But the thrust of our work is really around forensic sciences, and we use it to exonerate, and that's DNA evidence. And unfortunately, unreliable forensic evidence has led to 50% of wrongful convictions are attributable, at least in part, to flawed forensic sciences. So
really, that many, and those are the issues, like basically the types of problems that we talk about on the show, like the arson liquid pooling, or the hair strand matches, or the bite marks, or those types of things.
Yeah, and there are various levels of reliability, and some of these techniques, the thresholds are known and some are not, and some are entirely speculative, and some is, speculation masquerading as science. And, it's very hodgepodge groups of different forensic techniques that make up forensic sciences. So you have a technique like forensic DNA analysis, which was born in a laboratory and has applications beyond the criminal justice system, and therefore has been subjected to rigorous testing. And then you have the techniques that are used to put people in jail. And as long as they keep putting people in jail, there's not that much incentive to get it right.
Right, and so those techniques, and I think this is what I sort of understood through talking with you about this more, the real difference between DNA testing and these other techniques is that DNA testing was developed by scientists in a laboratory. It was, through a peer review process, right? Whereas these forensic, and so that's why we know that they're successful, is because they've sort of been through that, process of scientific revision. Whereas these forensic science techniques were often not developed by scientists. They were developed by law enforcement, or they're very old science. And the reason that they persist is not because they've been proven to be efficacious in finding out what the truth is, but because they've been effective at making cases, right? That's sort of the fitness that they have is in locking people up, but not necessarily have they been peer reviewed to say, oh, this actually, bite marks can actually tell you which, like what teeth left what impression.
Right. That's exactly right. Most forensics they appeal to your sense of intuition. And, for example, bite marks were born out of a robbery in the 1950s in Texas, where the burglar broke into a little house on the prairie in Texas, and during his rounds, he took a bite out of a piece of cheese in the fridge and then left it on the table. And some enterprising young detective came in and noted the bitten cheese and said, aha, I see we have a piece of cheese here that has been bitten by the perpetrator. And they matched that cheese to a suspect, and bite mark analysis was born.
But it was never no PhD with or published a paper saying, oh, if you look at bite marks, you can find in 95% of cases, if you look at it like this, like there was never any sort of rigor applied to that. It's just cops basically going like, hey, look at matches, and then judges and juries say, works for us.
Right.
And that works well enough that we've been doing that for decades.
Right. I mean, you're talking about data, right? Did they have any data? No, yes. There's no data. And worse is that it's presented in these highly elaborate courtroom displays, and this is true with many, many forensic techniques, where collection of the data, very sophisticated photography or analytical instrumentation generally, where you have to have some smarts to be able to run these machines, and the vocabulary is very complex and scientific sounding, and the experts have real facility for the language of science and for the showmanship that goes into courtroom presentations. But what was lacking, and what no jurors really understood, and frankly, no courts or no judges, no prosecutors, no defense attorneys, is that there's nothing underlying these presentations. There's no data. It's subjective and it's speculative often.
Wow. So it's really just, the expert, say in the case of bite mark analysis, almost just like eyeballing it or saying, oh, well, I've done this many times, so I'm sure I'm right. But there isn't any sort of third-party verification or any sort of rigor applied to the process.
That's exactly right. And courts have not required any rigor. I mean, and what you have right today in the status quo is that you have scientifically illiterate judges that are being presented evidence by scientifically illiterate prosecutors that are being resisted by scientifically illiterate defense attorneys. And then the validity and reliability of these techniques are weighed by 12 scientifically illiterate jurors. And what we get is just a lot of unreliable science that has really never been subjected to any real scrutiny inside or outside the courtroom.
Man, that's so insane. I mean, that's why when we sort of found out about this, we were like, we have to do an episode about this, because our show is often about sort of common wisdom that sticks around, for no reason, like just through inertia, through a life of its own, despite the fact that there was never anything underpinning it. And this is really the example of that has the most impact on people's lives. Like, it doesn't really matter that, facts like, you don't need to drink 8 glasses of water a day or whatever stick around. Like, people just drink a little too much water. The risk is not very high. But this is a case where you have unscientific common wisdom or unscientific practices that are putting people in prison for often the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and putting aside your show on circumcision, which gave me pause, yes, life and liberty issues are being weighed and are on balance on these. And, the fact that courts and legislatures have not required rigorous validation research and demonstrations of reliability of these techniques it's a disgrace, frankly. And we know this is a problem because of DNA exonerations, and we can point to the victims and of the unreliable science, and we know that there's a path forward here. And we know that foundational research can and should be done, and reliability studies can and should be done, and error rates can be established, and nobody is calling for removal of forensic sciences from use in criminal trials. But what we are asking for is to do the research, roll up your sleeves and do the research. Imagine, for example, if the FDA, right, is going to introduce pills onto the market, say, we think that these are good for losing weight, try them out. If anybody dies, then we'll think about doing some research to see whether or not they work. And that it isn't actually killing people, and that, but we still think it's good for, its intended purpose, and we'll figure it out. We'll wait and see. And that's essentially what's been done with forensics, except for even the wait and see aspect wasn't there. Is this, you get one decision from one court that says that I'm going to admit this evidence, and then all the other courts that don't want to have a hearing and don't know anything about science and are trying to facilitate, thousands of cases that are coming across the transom every day, we'll just simply rely on precedent and say, well, this court let this evidence in, I'm going to let it in. And the chances that a judge will be overruled or overturned on appeal because he or she let in a piece of scientific evidence that didn't meet evidentiary muster is almost zero.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's what really struck me was the sort of vision of these experts, quote experts who, you sort of have this image in my head that, the question the expert gets asked is, oh, you've testified in many cases of this type, right? Oh, yes, I've testified in 200 cases and I'm an expert on this subject. But then the idea that, oh, wait, the person saying that, they might have just done that many cases. Like that doesn't mean their method works. It just means they were able to convince the first court, which meant they were also able to convince the second court, and now they have this long sort of track record without anything underpinning it at the very beginning. Yeah,
just because something's been around for a long time doesn't make it reliable. I mean, that's a thrust of, nobody knows that as well as you, it seems.
That's basically the thesis of our entire show.
Right. So That's often true. You know, and the politics behind forensics can be intense and sometimes personal. You know, and I've had, you know, nose-to-nose arguments with forensic scientists at American Academy of Forensic Sciences meetings and arguing about the validity of a particular technique. And I've actually had experts say, well, why is it admitted in court? If you're saying it's not reliable, why do judges keep letting it in? And, you know, the only thing I can say is, you know, exactly.
Yeah, you have the same question. It's just the emphasis is on a different word. Yeah, why is this being admitted in court? That's what I want to know. Yeah,
right.
You know, my naive understanding of the world is that, like, well, if there's someone in court, you know, going into a court saying, hey, this is scientific, that there should be some sort of oversight from someone in the government. Should be like, all right, is this, you know, do you have a couple peer-reviewed studies that say that this works? Or, you know, we have that idea that should be the case, but it doesn't seem like there is. And it sounds like the work that the Innocence Project tries to do is you're trying to call for that oversight just from the outside and by really putting a lot of pressure on these individual cases. Is that correct?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, part of it is the individual cases, and really part of it is the, you know, hundreds of wrongful convictions in the aggregate. You know, I mean, and what we at the Innocence Project, you know, advocate for, and this relates back to what we were just talking about in terms of it being too late once it's introduced in court, and once a judge is considering whether to admit or not admit a particular piece of evidence, is farther upstream fixes, right? And this is the federal government, and we have advocated that the National Institute of Standards and Technology should take over the role of evaluating the data that is presented as validation research and for these particular techniques and demonstrate the reliability of these techniques so we know as a nation that we can rely on this type of evidence. Right.
So one thing that I found so fascinating when we were talking on set was, you know, I often ask the experts, what are you doing after this? And you were like, oh, I'm flying to, I forget which state, South Carolina, something along those lines, to try a case of a man, like, in a few days, right?
Right.
And so that's like a large part of your work, right, is you're literally going around the country taking on individual cases. Can you talk about how doing that and, you know, the work of the Innocence Project, trying to, you know, free individual wrongfully imprisoned prisoners, you know, how that ties in with strategic litigation in terms of creating a larger movement?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, when we began the work in forensics, we took a look at all of the trace evidence techniques. And when I say trace evidence, I'm talking about tire treads, shoe prints, fingerprints, ballistics, tool marks, bite marks, trace evidence from crime scenes. And, you know, the 2009 National Academy of Sciences report on forensics had, you know, essentially concluded that only DNA evidence was capable of individualizing to one particular source a crime scene sample.
Wow. So all of those things, which are, you know, things that I think anyone listening to this will be familiar from, I don't know, your average Law and Order or CSI episode, none of those things that you listed are capable of like tying something to a particular person. Is that the idea?
Right. I mean, there hasn't been, the validation research hasn't been done to demonstrate that we can say with scientific certainty that a particular individual left even a latent print at a crime scene, and to say nothing of bite marks.
Even fingerprints, yeah.
Even fingerprints, right? They're you know, I mean, and I think that one of the things that's lost in the fingerprint debate is the fact that when you're talking about latent fingerprints at crime scenes, you're talking about smudges on walls and other substrates, and often very, very little information. So we're not talking about full rolled fingerprints that you find, you know, when somebody's deliberately lifting a fingerprint. What you're talking about is a latent print that's invisible to the naked eye and might contain very, very little information. And so regardless of whether or not fingerprints are actually unique, you know, I mean, I think many people believe that they are, is that we don't know how similar they are and how much information you need to establish uniqueness. So that's, you know, I think often lost.
we have that image that the fingerprint is going to be this perfect printing, like when you sort of do it, with an ink pad.
Right.
But in the actual case, it could be like 5% of the person's, I don't know, loops and whorls or whatever they're called, like smudged in a weird way. And then when they're just compared subjectively, there can be a high rate of error when you have such little information from the actual fingerprint.
Right, exactly. And so, we looked at these different trace evidence techniques and, identified bite mark comparison evidence as really the least reliable, and the least amount of validation research had been done, and an incredible amount of wrongful convictions that were attributable to this particular technique. And we litigate these cases all over the country on bite marks in an effort to eliminate their use in criminal courts. So sometimes we'll do Daubert or Fry hearings, and those are the two types of hearings that courts conduct in advance of admitting a particular technique into a trial. So the objective is that the courts are supposed to be exercising their gatekeeping function and excluding unreliable evidence. So we will enter into criminal cases, sometimes death penalty cases, and argue just about the scientific evidence, and, we're arm's length from the actual case. And then there are some post-conviction innocence cases that we work on that involve bite mark analysis. And in those cases, what we know today, and even the bite mark experts themselves will admit, that the technique is not capable of identifying the biter to the exclusion of everybody else on the planet. But we also know that there are dozens and dozens and perhaps hundreds of people that are currently sitting in prison that have been put there by bite mark evidence, that there's no voice in the scientific community, however defined, that would still argue that you could say with certainty that one person made a particular bite mark. But these people have been imprisoned on precisely that type of testimony. And so we are trying to go back into court on some of these and just say, it's hard to say without DNA evidence whether somebody is guilty or innocent. But what we can say is that this person was convicted on grossly unreliable evidence and deserves a fair trial. And nowhere is that more true in death penalty cases. So we focus sometimes on those.
So this is bite mark analysis. My understanding is, of all of these forensic science techniques that are unreliable to varying degrees, right?
Right.
Bite mark analysis is the one that is widely now accepted that the entire sort of field is was unreliable, and so now no one is of any reliability is currently using it, but there are still people who are in prison as a result. So it's sort of like the lowest hanging fruit in terms of like this is like the grossest example.
The worst offender, yes. But what you just said about nobody, and what I just said about nobody accepting this as valid and reliable science is largely true. You can't find any articles in mainstream media supporting the use of bite mark analysis. But it's as if you enter La La Land when you enter the criminal justice system, where it's still admissible evidence in every single state in our country. Every single state, it's admissible. And some of the precedent that's relied on to admit this evidence are cases of first impression, like the Robert Lee Stinson case and the LaVon Brooks case. Robert Lee Stinson is in Wisconsin, and LaVon Brooks is in Mississippi. And these two cases had pretrial hearings to determine whether bite mark evidence should have been admitted in those cases. Both cases admitted the evidence. Both cases went to their state Supreme Courts. Both times, the courts in cases, the first time that they were considering this evidence, found it to be reliable, valid science, and upheld the court's decision to admit it in the first place. And Robert Lee Stinson and LaVon Brooks were both innocent. They both had been exonerated by DNA evidence. Cumulatively, they spent 50 years in prison on this evidence. And you can still, and I have litigated cases, literally litigated cases, where prosecutors have cited to these cases for the admissibility of bite mark evidence, even though we know as a factual matter that the gentlemen that were convicted in those cases were factually innocent. And it's still good law.
So they're still using it as a precedent. Oh, because it worked in this case, we should be able to use it in our case, even though the case they're citing, it was a wrongful conviction, and we know that beyond the shadow of a doubt.
Without any possible doubt. The trouble is that once a defendant has been indicted and the forces of the government are arrayed against him or her, more often him, that the it's very, very hard for any court to exclude evidence that will help convict what, the reality is most people think is a guilty defendant, right? And so the ends justify the means, and why that may be expeditious in an actual guilty case, and it's hard to get too exercised about somebody who's guilty of a crime being convicted of the crime. But the reality is that those decisions matter, and they matter, for that case, and then they matter for all the cases that follow. And they also matter for the type of confidence that an expert who really has no business being in court and being deemed an expert by a court, testifying as an expert. But once that happens once, and you've been so declared by a court, those experts have real confidence that they can withstand cross-examination, that they can help advance justice, and that they can testify the next time that, as you were indicating earlier, that, yes, I've testified before, and I was qualified as an expert, and I can continue to give this type of testimony. And, it's self-perpetuating. And, and that's, what we are trying to do in strategic litigation and at the Innocence Project more broadly is to roll that back. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do when we can stand here on the outside of the criminal justice system and look around and saying that bite mark evidence is an antiquated, obviously unreliable technique. And then, here in New York City, we litigated a pretrial bite mark case in a homicide here. And the Manhattan DA's office sought successfully to introduce bite mark evidence in that case, individualization testimony in a homicide case. The Manhattan DA's office is supposed to be, one of the best in the country and populated by very, very smart, well-intentioned attorneys. And, they fought tooth and nail for years to get that evidence admitted. Some of the most prominent experts in statistics in the country had submitted an affidavit, and Karen Cafeter testified in the hearing. And I think that we wrote 4 briefs or something like that and 2 motions.
Everybody saying, please don't do this. This is not good evidence, basically.
Right. And then the court just let it all in with no caveats and not even a written decision.
Wow. Hey, I'm talking to Chris Fabricant from the Innocence Project. I will be back in just a moment, so stick around.
I love forget-me-nots.
I'm Jesse.
I'm Jordan.
And we've been doing Jordan Jesse Go for almost 10 years now.
And it's not gotten any easier to describe.
So we asked our fans to do it for us.
Jordan Jesse Go is a weekly conversation with
2 best pals,
2 hilarious friends,
the hilarious smart kids
talking about hilarious stuff that happens to them.
Mostly really stupid stuff.
Awkward anecdotes, insane tangents, heartfelt stuff.
It's like being thrown in the middle of a hilarious conversation between you and your best pal.
It's a show that makes me laugh every week, which is pretty rare and wonderful.
It might be the best thing on the internet.
One of the funniest things you will hear.
And it's the best part of my week and has kept me company for the past 7 years through all sorts of life. I love those guys.
That's Jordan Jesse Go, the comedy podcast that's been named Best of iTunes.
Every Monday on MaximumFun.org or your favorite podcasting software.
I'll hug you and kiss you and love you. Love you. Love you. Love you.
Welcome back to Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast. I'm here talking to Innocence Project attorney Chris Fabricant, who appeared on the Forensic Science episode of Adam Ruins Everything. Well, let's talk about these so-called experts, because especially in bite mark testimony, my understanding is that a lot of these so-called bite mark experts are just sort of, especially at the height of bite mark testimony, just ended up being sort of like dentists on the loose, like these sort of guys who got in the business of giving expert testimony and were sort of doing it because it made them feel like, big important guys and let them brag on the golf course or whatever, but sort of had no business testifying. Is that the case?
Yeah, the Ted Bundy case really kind of led to dentists going wild. Like after, the bite mark analysis had been around for some time. As I mentioned earlier, the 1950s is the first reported case. But in the 70s, particularly after the Ted Bundy case, where bite mark evidence was used to help convict him, and that was such a sensational trial, and some of the godfathers of bite mark analysis testified in that case, and they became rock stars. They were in high demand around the country. They featured in a lot of media presentations, and the forensic sides of their practice became, very, very important sidelines to their work. As you know, who wants to sit around at a cocktail party and talking about cleaning teeth when you can talk about forensic odontology and putting away the bad guys?
Right. You're like, well, yes, actually, I testified in a case the other day, and it was horrible. And then suddenly everyone's crowded around you and hanging on your every word. I can imagine why that would be appealing to someone, more than putting in, filling cavities.
Right. Yeah. When was the last time you were at a cocktail party talking about filling cavities?
Yeah. But could you tell me about? I know because we were talking before we got on about this recent encounter you had with this guy Michael West. Could you fill me in on that?
Oh my God!
I mean, it's basically you were involved in a deposition the guy gave, and it actually kind of went viral. The Washington Post wrote about it because the transcript is so crazy. This is a guy, and this is me giving the broad strokes version, so please fill me in. But this is a guy who's like been sort of widely exposed as a fraud and having given like countless false testimony that people are in prison for. And you're trying to get him to give a deposition, and he's just saying the most outlandish, like rude, bizarre things to you in court. He called you a sociopath. I have a transcript. He called you a sociopath and an asswipe. I'm sorry to make you relive it. This is very cruel. But can you fill me in? Like what was that about?
Well, to go back a little bit, this is a death penalty case, and it's an active death penalty case, and our client Eddie Lee Howard is currently on death row in Mississippi, and he was put there by Dr. Michael West's testimony associating an alleged bite mark with an elderly murder victim to our client Eddie Lee Howard, to the exclusion of everybody else on the planet. It's the only physical evidence in the case, period.
Wow,
and
so nothing else.
Nothing else exists that would associate Mr. Howard with this horrible crime that was committed. And it was during the heyday of Dr. West's work with a forensic pathologist named Stephen Hain. And they worked together for many years in Mississippi and have been involved in many, many, many controversial cases. So we argued that the Eddie Lee Howard case in the Mississippi Supreme Court about 2 years ago, the court remanded it down to the trial court where Mr. Howard was convicted in the first place for an evidentiary hearing involving Dr. West and some of the other experts that testified at that trial, and also some of new experts around bite mark evidence. And prior to the evidentiary hearing in Mississippi, you're entitled to a deposition, a civil deposition, to depose opposing experts. And so I got on a plane from New York and flew down to Memphis. And when I got to the Memphis airport, typically, I get, the cheapest possible car that you can drive to get from point A to point B, because I'm on the Innocence Project's limited dimes. And they ran out of the pieces of junk that I usually get, and they gave me a bright orange Mustang convertible to drive. And so you had this slick New York lawyer driving down to Hattiesburg, Mississippi, in a bright orange convertible Mustang.
Is this My Cousin Vinny? Is this a plot of My Cousin
Vinny?
It's right
out of my... Exactly.
Like, oh, you are from around these parts, are you, son?
No, that became immediately apparent if it hadn't been already. And so I rolled into Mississippi in my Mustang and to a law office down there. And I had this deposition with Dr. West. Tucker Carrington, the director of the Mississippi Innocence Project, and I did this together. And Dr. West, in addition to the many names that he called me, he it's hard to describe in a few words. The transcripts kind of speak for itself. I'd never been called on the record under oath an asswipe, and then he corrected himself and called me Mr. Asswipe, and that he called me a sociopath, and I asked him to define what a sociopath meant to him. And the irony really is that his definition is, often is the accusation leveled at Dr. West. And, when, everybody, I think, felt like they needed a shower at the end of the deposition. And sadly, this went on about 2 weeks before the actual evidentiary hearing began. And we are now in the middle of this evidentiary hearing. And I'm actually still in the middle of cross-examining Dr. West for this hearing.
Oh, wow, this case is still going on.
Yes, it is. And, I think we're kind of a long way from a decision and we're a long way from done with Dr. West. So that was just, round one, essentially, in what promises to be a long fight.
But so this is a guy who over many years, his testimony sent a lot of people to prison, and many of the people who he sent to, like, it's been shown that his evidence was incorrect in many cases and that people were wrongfully imprisoned, and he seems to show very little remorse or to take that not very seriously at all. Correct?
That's a gross understatement, right? He could certainly care less about any of it, and he defined this as my problem throughout the deposition. And Lavon Brooks and Kennedy Brewer, both of whom were exonerated through post-conviction DNA evidence that was, could not have been more clear. And also, they identified through DNA evidence the actual perpetrator of the two murders that Lavon Brooks and Kennedy Brewer were convicted of. And the true perpetrator confessed to murdering and raping both of these little girls. Wow. And giving a very lengthy and detailed confession, and then was asked whether he had bitten them. And he said, no, I'm not a sicko. I didn't bite them. The only thing that he denied was biting them. And that was the evidence that put Lavon Brooks and Kennedy Brewer away, and Kennedy Brewer was sentenced to death. So wow. And I asked Dr. West about these cases during the deposition and during this evidentiary hearing, and he maintains that they're both guilty. And Dr. West says that the only thing that the DNA evidence proved was that the actual perpetrator was the rapist, and that Lavon Brooks and Kennedy Brewer were holding down the victims and biting them while the other perpetrator was raping them. That's his theory now.
His theory is that the guy who confessed to the crime held down the victim, and the guys who he identified just came in and bit the victim.
Right. Well, that's the only way that he can explain their bite marks being on the victim's body.
My God.
Yeah. So he says this with one of the few things he said with a straight face was this new theory.
Wow, that's incredible.
It's sadly true. Michael West is just not an outlier in this. I mean, he's more outrageous and his language is saltier than many others. But there's a case that my colleague Nina Morrison has been litigating in West Virginia called Joe Buffy for many, many, many years. And in that case, there was an elderly woman. Somebody broke into her house during the day, held her at knife point, walked her around the house for at least an hour. I'm not sure exactly how long, but while he was stealing various items, and then he raped her repeatedly and left. Then they had what was recently determined and discovered, and the West Virginia Supreme Court found, is that the prosecution in that case had exculpatory DNA evidence before Joe Buffy pled guilty in the case. And Joe Buffy pled guilty because he had falsely confessed, which is the third leading contributing factor to wrongful conviction, is false confession.
Right, that was something we didn't even get into in our episodes, how common false confessions are and how good police are at extracting them, even when they're not necessarily trying to.
Right.
Like, we have this idea that no one would ever falsely confess, but it's this hugely common thing because of the way that the questioning is done. But please go on.
Yeah, what happened was after Joe Buffy's conviction was overturned, the prosecution now has the theory that there were two perpetrators, right? The victim survived here and said, there was one person, there was one rapist, there was one burglar, one man who did this to me. And, since that person whose DNA has been identified through a CODIS hit, now the state is apparently going to retry Joe Buffy now on a two-perpetrator theory. So,
why? Just to not admit their mistake, or
that's another good question.
What's the motivation?
It's very, very difficult for anybody to really admit that they're wrong, just as a general matter, and to admit that you may have made a mistake that led to an innocent man spending decades in prison is, sometimes too much to even contemplate. And then there's also, a tunnel vision aspect of what we're talking about, in that you get this idea and it's an unshakable belief in whatever, that belief is. There's a book that a colleague pointed out to me when we were really kind of head scratching around this idea that there are those that, no matter how many wrongful convictions are attributable to bite mark analysis and how much new research debunks all the fundamental assumptions, that these experts still hold on to it as reliable evidence. And my friend and colleague Dana Delger gave me this book that called When Prophecy Fails. And basically the thrust is that, all these doomsdayers who say, the end of the world is, on a specific date and get very, specific about it and solve it. And then that date comes and goes. What happens after that? And, while you and I might think that, well, they decide to go back to their job selling insurance and abandon this idea of doomsday scenarios, but that's not what happens. People double down and their belief becomes stronger.
Right.
And so
even though they've explicitly been proven wrong, they have that reaction of like, oh, well, I wasn't wrong. What happened was there was some other weird thing that there was some other thing, and they managed to justify their own sort of core identity belief.
Right. There are two rapists.
Yeah.
Right? Or there's a rapist and a biter. Right. It's that's prophecy has failed.
So let me ask you this, because I think we have this idea, and a lot of it comes, I think, from TV still, where you see, the way it often works on an episode of Law and Order is they have a theory, and then the theory's proven wrong, and they're like, oh, it couldn't have been that. It must be something else, right? Like our image of cops and prosecutors is that they're sort of like crime scientists, and they're trying to figure out what actually happened to bring the case. But then the more I read about what actually happens in these cases is that it's much more, they take the adversarial thing much more seriously, and it's like their job is simply to bring a case, right? That they, the job of the people, investigating and prosecuting is to find a person who they can pin it on and bring them to trial, and that is what they'll do. That doesn't mean they'll always get it wrong, obviously, but they sort of will end up taking the path of least resistance. So it's like, okay, well, we got some hair and we got some, bite marks or whatever, and these things have worked before, so we'll just do them. We'll just use them because that lets us get someone, in the defendant's chair, and, we'll let the defense handle it on their own. But that seems to, and, I assume, I've not gone to school for philosophy of law or anything, so I don't know maybe there's a very good reason to have that sort of adversarial system, but it seems to result in the promulgation of these bad methods because, they're methods that don't lead to the truth. They're methods that help bring cases. Does that seem apt? Or, I mean, what are your thoughts?
Well, you said a lot there, Adam. I
sure did.
So I think to state as a threshold inquiry is that I don't think that police officers or prosecutors seek just to get a warm body in the defendant's chair. I think that for the most part, these, overwhelmingly, the people in charge of bringing somebody to justice and to prosecuting the defendant believe in the guilt of the defendant. It isn't so much that, that they're just going to get somebody. But what happens often, and we haven't talked about cognitive bias issues yet, but what you have is the belief in guilt of a particular individual. Most crimes are pretty easy to solve, right? It's, and the bread and butter crimes don't require forensic evidence. It's the when you get more difficult crimes to solve, and you get an anchoring bias on the part of the police or the prosecutors. And what I mean by anchoring bias is that you have this notion as to the likely perpetrator. Let's take like the Von Brooks and Kennedy Brewer cases that we were talking about. And that in those cases, the Von Brooks and Kennedy Brewer were both like the boyfriend or stepfather to the victims, right? And so many of these little child abuse cases and that are like this are, it's the boyfriend who did it, right? So the biological mother brings home somebody new. That's the way it's cast, as like that the mom wasn't adequately protecting their child against the predator that she brought into the house. And so that's like a narrative that's playing out often in a police officer's mind, comes to a crime scene like this, and the idea is that there are only a couple of people in the house, right? So there's LaVon Brooks, the biological mom, and the daughter. And in the morning, the daughter is gone, and she's later found in a swamp, having been raped and murdered. So the obvious suspect is the boyfriend, right? But nobody thought about what actually happened was that somebody lifted up the window of the house and abducted the little girl and murdered her. Mm-hmm. So that's not the kind of investigation, but you get this anchoring bias and say, okay, well, it had to have been LaVon Brooks. He's here. He's good for it. You know what I mean? And then you have a forensic technique that is so subjective and so unreliable that you can gather up what appears to be scientific evidence to prove your case. And you have people that, let's give them the benefit of the doubt, are acting in good faith. They're just using unreliable science. And suddenly you have a case that looks like a very strong case. You had, the opportunity. We have scientific evidence associating with it. Maybe you even have a confession. And so that's I think much more likely of a scenario that will lead to wrongful conviction. It's post-conviction where you get, theories that, at least on the surface, appear to be in bad faith. Where you're saying that that we don't really care about the truth. And that's why it's very frustrating for the lawyers who do the DNA exonerations in my office will get fought tooth and nail often to get DNA testing done, right? And so in other words, we just want to know, let's find the truth, right? We're all interested in the truth, right? We're not going to litigate this case if our client is included in the DNA sample, we're done, right? Yeah. So it's always been baffling to me and to many people, like-minded people, is why not just get the DNA testing done?
Right. I mean, it seems like the... falsely imprisoning someone or falsely convicting someone who didn't commit a crime is such a clear civic sin, right? It's everyone's nightmare is to go to prison for a crime they didn't commit. I mean, it's a common, just simple nightmare for people to have, and it's to imprison one of our fellow citizens for doing something they didn't commit is such an obvious thing that it seems like everyone should be on board with. Reducing the amount that happens and correcting that error, it's beyond a miscarriage of justice. It's like it seems like an ultimate failing of society for that to happen. It's so baffling that anyone wouldn't be on the side of trying to correct that. That if you brought that kind of evidence, that everyone involved wouldn't immediately go, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Well, yes, let us help fix this. Right this wrong immediately." It's stunning.
It's funny because I was a defense attorney for many years, a public defender in the South Bronx, and I was used to, my cocktail party conversation was often, centered around how I could defend those guys. And, wearing the black hat essentially in many different circles, less so in a place like New York City, but certainly out and around the country, much more so. Mm-hmm. And, when I've been at the Innocence Project for, many years now, but I am amazed at how many adversaries there are, to, fundamental reform objectives, particularly in forensic sciences, in that, vitriolic responses to calls for research. Right. And so, there are a lot of, entrenched stakeholders, and there are many, many of those that feel like the criminal justice system is working fine. And the victims of wrongful conviction and of some of the other, injustices that are meted out every day in the criminal justice system are poor people of color. And, these are people that haven't had a voice in the reform efforts until very, very recently. And so the constituencies, that might have been lobbying for change and for a more fair and just system just didn't have a voice.
We have to wrap up, unfortunately. But for people who are affected by this issue, or who are listening to this and are as struck by it as I am, is there anything that you would recommend they do to help with this issue, or is there anything that we can, other than cutting a check to the Innocence Project? Mm-hmm. How is this something that we can help to solve?
I think that the more people that are in, I think that one is that you should cut a check to the Innocence Project. We're doing good work, and And
I mean, it was before we even did the show. I was amazed by the work that. I mean, it's such a clear, important thing that needs to be done.
But the beyond that, I mean, I think that civic engagement is an old-fashioned and quaint notion, but the reality really is that activism works, and really, it's not enough to cut a check to the Innocence Project, although that's a good start. But the idea is that, is to stay engaged with the issues, go to the meetings, press your congressman, press your senator, write your op-eds, volunteer your time with the public defender's office or reentry programs or victim rights organizations. And I mean, it's, the criminal justice system is the de facto government for millions and millions of low-income Americans. And the idea that it's their problem is becoming more and more clear that it's not. And I think it's important to engage those that aren't necessarily involved in it and you wouldn't necessarily expect, particular stakeholders, or I didn't even call them stakeholders, but people that aren't thinking about criminal justice issues can be educated in this way. And I've seen it, in my own family and particularly in my in-laws, because my in-laws are Irish Catholic, so there are tons of them. And they have all different types of political views, and the uniform response that we get to exoneration work, but also to the idea of mass incarceration and racial justice being a value. Well, one is a value and one is a problem that are becoming front and central campaign issues in the presidential elections, but should also be local elections, and that we can do much, much better as a society. And I encourage those, not to skip those articles in the newspaper and not to disengage because you don't have anybody that you love in prison, but to stay engaged because how we treat the prisoners in our society is the most accurate reflection of what kind of society we want to have and what kind of society we actually have.
I mean, that's a very powerful note to end on. Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you for talking to us and for doing the work that you do. It's really incredible stuff. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Adam. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you once again to Chris Fabricant for coming on the show. I hope you guys enjoyed listening to that interview as much as I enjoyed having it. And that is it for Adam Ruins Everything, the podcast, this bi-week. We're bi-weekly, so I'm not going to say this week. I'll say this bi-week. We'll be back in 2 weeks, so please tune in then. Our producer is Shara Morris. If you like the show, please be sure to tell a friend and subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast app. I use an app called Overcast. I don't know if you guys, what app do you use to listen to your podcasts? Tweet at me and tell me. There's so many great apps out there, and what a wonderful thing it is to live in an age when we have a cornucopia of podcast apps available to us, frankly. And don't forget to leave us a rating or a comment wherever you subscribe. And again, Adam Ruins Everything, the TV show, is back with new episodes every Tuesday at 10 p.m. on True TV, and you can find clips and full episodes at truetv.com. Write this down. Get a pen and write this down. truetv.com/Adam Ruins Everything. TrueTV, period key, com// not backslash, Adam Ruins Everything, no spaces, you don't have to capitalize anything. And the Watch True TV app is the other place you can get it. And that is it. Thank you guys so much. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
MaximumFun.org.
Comedy and culture. Artist owned.
Listener supported.